Okay, so this is the audio review for exam 2, Soc 5. Okay, so for the first one, or the first couple ones here, the first three here, I'm just looking for you to identify the different types of drugs. So depressants are drugs like alcohol or prescription pills that slow the nervous system. So typically, they affect your, the kind of medications, especially pain medications, things that, will say like do not operate a vehicle, right? Those are depressants. Narcotics are drugs that are opiates or opioids, yet oftentimes people use the word narcotics to represent all drugs, which is not right. It only refers to opiates and opioids. Stimulants are drugs that create a sense of energy, alertness, and well-being. So, obviously we tend to think of stimulants being, cocaine or methamphetamines, but often, we overlook the obvious one, which is caffeine, right, that a lot of people are addicted to. Binge drinking is heavy episodic drinking, where you drink more, enough alcohol in a 2-hour period to have more than a 0.08 alcohol blood level. Designer drugs are typically drugs that are like derivatives of legal substances, so that they can kind of circumvent the laws that restrict other drugs. So we get like bath salts and stuff. The difference between drug-defined crimes and drug-related crimes. Okay, so drug-defined crimes are crimes that are either about possession of a drug or the sale of a drug, right? Those are drug-defined crimes. Drug-related crimes are often violent behaviors that come about because a person is on drugs. Like, so someone is drunk or, using drugs, and so they act out violently, or they commit illegal acts in order to get drugs, right? So maybe stealing something so that you can then use the money for drugs. Those would be drug-related crimes. Okay, so interdiction is just the steps taken to interrupt illicit drug trafficking. So basically, across borders, typically, we're thinking about interdiction. Eradication is actually just destroying the plants that the drugs are being derived from, right? So typically we're talking about opium poppies, coca bushes, and cannabis. That eradication is really just about going into a field and burning it, right, to get rid of that issue. Let's see. Decriminalization is just a policy related to labeling theory, which proposes less harsh punishments for some minor offenses. So basically, you decriminalize certain offenses, and really, again, like when we talked about labeling theory, as labels can affect your self-identification and actually lead you to more deviant activities, decriminalization can often, kind of unstigmatize routine behaviors that, a lot of people engage in that therefore are just not considered as criminal anymore. And harm reduction is typically when you look at certain drug issues as a public health issue. So you try to lessen the risks and harms associated with illegal drug use. So like in a lot of other countries, they have places where people can, like in Los Angeles, we have needle exchange programs. But there's also, in other countries, they actually have facilities that people can go and use drugs. Because it's one of those things we don't think about, that a lot of people that overdose, especially on things like heroin, it's because they're alone, right? So they go and use drugs alone in their apartment. They're not found for days, or they go, to a motel or something and they're not found for days. Versus if you give someone a facility in which to use drugs in a kind of monitored, supervised way, they're safer and there's a lot less deaths as a result, right? Alrighty, moving on to chapter 3, Code of Restraint. Okay, so W.E.B. Du Bois is talking about how there's this group of society that's considered the submerged 10th, right? That they're very much beneath the surface of economic viability. They have so few resources that they're just struggling. And they're often characterized by people in society as irresponsible, as violent, as, drunk, right? Those kind of things. Deindustrialization and globalization have really impacted the economy in inner city neighborhoods. So we talked about how Globalization brought us technology and capabilities to expand markets to other countries, and as a result, it resulted in deindustrialization, which was moving factory labor from this country to manufacturing capitals, all over the world. So what happened was those factory jobs that used to sustain a lot of people within this economy left, but very few jobs, especially jobs that paid well and had any sort of benefits or retirement, actually replaced any of those jobs, right? So that caused all sorts of economic problems. When it comes to eroding faith in the criminal justice system, this is basically just the issue that if the residents of the neighborhood don't feel like they can call the police and that the police will respond, or they feel like they're not going to be taken seriously, then people start to feel like they have to take their own security into their own hands, right? And that means that they have to be more willing to engage in violence and more willing to portray themselves as someone that you don't want to mess with. So this isn't just about the adults. The adults teach this to the children as well to keep them safe within the neighborhood, that they have to be able to stand up. If someone provokes them violently, that they need to meet violence with violence. And so in a lot of ways, kids kind of get lured into the drug trade as part of this problem because the drug trade is so visible and because there's so few legitimate economic opportunities that it becomes the path of least resistance and a way to really make a lot more money, even though it's not legitimate. Okay, so the drug trade is organized around a code of conduct. So basically, violence as a means of social control is basically the answer to that, so I don't know how to explain that any more than that. Structural and cultural standpoint. So changes in work, kind of like going back to what we're talking about with deindustrialization and globalization, changes in work really caused a lot of people to lose their job. And because no jobs came back to replace them, it created a situation of joblessness for the poor. And the economy moved from manufacturing to service, so the service jobs themselves are often minimum wage, they are often part-time, and they're still, they're not going to be able to sustain people at a decent standard of living. So this created a lot of the problems that people then consider moral outrage, right? We talked about the context of teen pregnancy and how, a lot of youth that don't feel like they have any opportunities in the future are just going to have kids young. That, the rise of the underground economy is a part of this too, where, of course, a lot more people are going to be persuaded to sell drugs and risk their lives in that kind of economy when there's no legitimate economy, to be a balance to that. All right, let's see, going for bad. So basically, this is just the idea that it's not just financially lucrative to be a gang member or drug dealer in this kind of neighborhood, but drug dealers themselves also have much more access to women who want to date them, right? They have higher status than other men in the neighborhood. So as much as it is an economic thing, it's also the status, the respect that people give you, the fact that women want to date you, which is a reason why a lot of young men get lured into that. A common way into the drug trade is through neighborhood peer groups. That's just the answer to that one. Guns have personality and status attached. By that, I just mean that since guns are often reused from crime to crime, a gun could have a particular set of crimes already attached to it. And if it's like hot potato. If you get caught with that potato, you're going to jail for all the crimes associated with that gun. So guns have personality and status attached based on what they were used for previously. So is there murder attached to it? Is there robbery attached to it? Things like that affect the personality and status of the gun. It's common for people in the neighborhood to think that you can avoid a stick-up, right? And the mentality is that if you just don't go out late at night, if you don't go into dark alleys, if you really just don't go to anywhere that's gang-controlled, then you can avoid being mugged or being stuck up, right? But so really, it's kind of a victim-blaming thing. So if someone does get mugged in the street or robbed in some way, it's like, well, why did you go down that alley? Why did you go out at night or things like that? Instead of really focusing on they're the victim of a crime, right? But the mentality, the key to that stick-up mentality is that people in the neighborhood then feel like they have some power over whether this happens to them or not. Okay, so the stick-up ballet is just the idea that if you're going to survive being robbed, you have to give the right amount of respect to the person robbing you. And that means you have to adapt to their demands so that your life is not at risk. See but don't see just refers to the fact that the residents in the neighborhood see drug transactions physically in public and that they understand the financial lure of that drug trade. And so as more and more of the youth, start selling drugs, it just becomes more prominent and prevalent. All right, chapter 4. So, according to rational choice theory, teen pregnancy makes sense in the code of the street because these young women feel like they don't have a future, but it doesn't make sense in the larger context of society, right? Because most young women are not going to have a kid as a teenager because it would lower their status and make their life more complicated. When it comes to the social context, this youth's at risk, it's the fact that, obviously, like I was saying before, residents understand that, the drug trade has a financial lure to it. And so the youths themselves are at risk of being lured into the street culture, even if their parents are decent oriented and raised them to not have those values. So it's just the financial lure and the social lure that pulls people in. When it comes to role models, the old heads are the ones that are those decent male role models who try to be surrogate fathers to all the kids in the neighborhood. The Robin Hood drug dealer is a different kind of role model that's street-oriented, that is often trying to lure kids into the street or to sell drugs for him by helping out impoverished neighborhood youth or their families to kind of be this Robin Hood to the youth, but then kind of convince them to themselves enter the drug trade. Social class here, I'm just talking about how social class affects the way that we end up dating, right? Our dating behaviors really have a lot to do with our social class. The wealthier you are, the more controlled your dating is. The poorer you are, the less controlled it is. Two opposite drives. So here, I'm just referring to the idea that when it comes to the relationships between men and women in the neighborhood, the girls are looking for long-lasting, loving relationships, someone that's going to financially provide for them and take them out of the neighborhood, while the guys are looking for someone that they can have sex with so that their friends will think they're cool, right? So it's very opposite drives that are kind of driving this situation that often results in teen pregnancy. The common conception that young women have a lot of partners is really kind of, coming from racial stereotypes in the culture. And really, there's also kind of stereotypes that if a woman says that, you're her baby's father, that it's because she's trying to trap you so that you'll take care of her financially. And so this means that a lot of men end up denying their children. Let's see. Objectification. Okay, so here I was just talking about what was the goal of men in this kind of mating game. It wasn't just about having sex with a woman. It was about controlling her body, of course, but also controlling her mind and making her actually fall in love with you. Let's see here. Oh, game and rap. Basically getting a woman, like convincing a woman to have sex with you, based on talking to her or making her interested in you is game, right? But then rap is like the actual words that you say. Let's see. Moving into chapter 9. All right, so when it comes to elements of differential association theory, differential associations may vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. Criminal behaviors learned in interactions with other people. Our directions of motives and drives are learned from those definitions that we get from others of, legal codes as favorable or unfavorable. And typically a person becomes delinquent because they have certain definitions that are favorable of breaking laws. Let's see. Classical conditioning is just a learning model that assumes that everything learns by associating a stimuli with a response. Like Pavlov's dog, right? The ringing of the bell. Differential reinforcement theory is just, just the definition from the book, right? That it's a theory of criminal behavior that emphasizes various types of social learning. And of course, specifically those classical and operant conditioning. And of course, modeling. Let's see. Operant conditioning is the other learning model, that it's not just about the stimuli um, and the response, it's also about a kind of feedback loop, right? The association between an action and what the response to that action is, that you can have positive and negative sanctions applied to your behaviors. Let's see, Bandura's theory of imitation modeling. So this is just a learning theory that basically says that we learn a lot of who we are and how we're supposed to act, like our attitudes or behaviors, from watching other people and then imitating what they do, right? The kind of Bobo doll thing. Alrighty, so then moving on to this one, chapter 5. Okay, so elements of the code that reflect tradition are decency and violence. That's literally that's all you need to know there. All right, the decent dad, right? That he is a role model. That there's certain things that he expects for being a role model. Like there's certain expectations he has, but there's also certain responsibilities, right? So his expectation is kind of patriarchal subservience, but his the roles that he has to provide is often protecting the family and financially providing. Caste systems are just systems of stratification where a person's opportunity is based on their birth. Apartheid, we watched the video, right, was a policy of segregation and political and economic discrimination in South Africa up until the early 90s. Let's see here. Class mobility is just the ability of a person to move up or down a social class in their lifetime, which is actually quite difficult. Most people end up dying in the social class they were born into, but we also know that there is a path to class mobility that's often education. When looking at conflict theory, they're just arguing that capitalism builds unequal opportunities, and as a result of unequal opportunities, there's a lot of inequality in society. Let's see. Social reproduction is the idea that social class tends to be reproduced generationally, right? Because of different cultural variations of social classes, and really just that it gets passed down from from parents to children. So those values also get passed down, and it reproduces social class differences. Everyday class consciousness is just kind of being aware of your own social class and the social class of other people, like reading it in them by how they dress or how they talk or any of those kind of things. That we often read each other to kind of get a sense of what someone's social class is, because we want to see how we need to treat them. And we often treat people with a higher social class in a much more deferential manner. Then if someone's poor, we're not going to respect them or treat them with the same level of respect. So we read people in interactions for their social class. All right, last up, chapter 10. Okay, so Cooley argued that the looking glass self is really the way that we understand and identify ourselves, is by looking at people's reactions to our behaviors and to our actions. Kind of like looking in a mirror to see what is reflected back to us. Goffman looked at the issue of stigma and how when someone's stigmatized, we push them away from the rest of society because we think like they're somehow infected and they're going to spread to the rest of us. So you basically take a person from being like a whole human person, and, the stigma basically denies them their whole personhood and kind of excludes them. They become tainted. Let's see. Primary deviance versus secondary deviance. So we talked about this, how primary deviance is just kind of like infrequent offending once in a while, where you might do something wrong, but you don't associate doing something wrong with being a bad person. Versus secondary deviance is the more serious, frequent offending, right? When people, they get caught, they get labeled as a criminal, and then they end up making the deviance part of their social role. Some basic assumptions of labeling theory. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of them, right? That nothing is intrinsically criminal, it's just what the laws define. That criminal definitions are enforced in the interest of the powerful, right? Like we talked about with the 101 rule. That the sanctions of any sort of criminal act tend to vary based on the characteristics of the offender. So we talked about how your race, your gender, your social class, your age, your sexuality, these things matter when it comes to if you're prosecuted, if you're sentenced, how long you're sentenced for, these kind of things. And then, of course, we have a criminal justice system that's founded on this notion of a criminal as a pariah, right? Someone that's a willful wrongdoer, that's just basically a bad person that deserves to be punished. So even when people are exonerated from the system, there's still a stigma attached to them that they can't quite, get away from. Peacemaking criminology is just incorporating religious, feminist, and critical theory to try to build a society that can reconciliate and mediate a lot of conflicts and disputes instead of sending people to the criminal justice system. And then lastly, I'm asking the difference between retributive justice and restorative justice. So retributive justice is a very one-sided approach where someone does something wrong, they violate the law, and you punish them, right? You incarcerate them, you give them a fine, whatever it might be. Restorative justice is when you try to repair the issue by kind of reaffirming a sense of shared values, right? So you basically connect the victim with the offender with the community, and you try to basically reintegrate the offender back into the community so that they still feel the pressure of that social contract and that they are then motivated to follow the laws, right? Because remember, the more disconnected a person is from the society, the less motivation they have to actually follow the laws. If you basically throw people away or, throw people in jail and throw away the key, there's no motivation to actually follow the laws if you're just going to be punished, damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? So restorative justice is trying to have people, obviously amend for what they've done, but also incorporating in the community aspect of serving the community. All right, that's it. If you study this, you're going to do well. Hopefully this is helpful.